oso ondo. Besterik gabe jarraian irekiera akademikoari emango diogu hasiera. A continuación daremos comienzo al Congreso con la apertura académica a cargo de los responsables de las dos instituciones organizadoras del evento. So now we will proceed with the academic opening of the event by the responsible of the two institutions which have organized the event. And just a short brackets comment, whoever that might need a translator to Spanish, from Spanish and Basque to English, they are in the entrance of the room. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It is said that an Englishman was praising the operation of a certain device, and a Frenchman objected. Yes, that works very well in practice, but does it work well in theory? It is not very appropriate to tell a joke reproducing national stereotypes of a Europe that is so many times blocked by its national short-sightedness. But it may be useful in order to explain what I intend to say. My hypothesis is that the European Union lives a theoretical moment, that is, a moment where conceptual innovation is essential if we want to escape from the deadlock we are in, which is, first of all, a conceptual deficit. It is true that European integration crisis cannot be solved simply with a good theory, but we will not emerge from the current crisis without a clarification of what is at stake. We need to talk more about concepts than about mechanisms and leaders. New significance and not financial or institutional engineering solutions will take us out of the crisis. It is less a matter of political will than a matter of understanding what is really at stake. It is not so much a problem that can be solved through institutional procedures and leadership, but a crisis that must be well diagnosed so that the basic concepts of democracy can be reconsidered in the context of that new complex reality that is the European Union, and in a globalized world where profound social and political changes are taking place. Among the many deficits attributed to the EU, one of the least denounced, though not less important, is the intelligibility deficit. There are big controversies as to whether Europe is democratic or fair, representative or efficient, but there is no doubt that it is currently incomprehensible and almost impossible to understand to anybody. Europe will make no sense as long as there isn't a narrative that can be understood and accepted by its citizens, that may even justify its relative distance, the delegation or complexity element that inevitably goes with it. Well then, I maintain that the EU must be understood as a complex democracy, not from democracy models related to the national state form, and therefore with great potentialities when it comes to thinking about how to politically organize more difficult, open and complex spaces. While, let me say, a philosophy of the European Union, there have been some claims about the importance of philosophy for the development of an appropriate concept of the European Union. But there are also those who consider that the European constitutionalism is over-theorized. I understand the distrust when faced with two theoretical approaches that usually wander comfortably on the theory space and avoid the institutional design or the complexity of the political game. But if the political philosophy has any ambition, it is to bridge that gap between theory and practice, between normative and descriptive, which is a sign of exhaustion shown by theories about Europe. A consequence of this rupture is the lack of cooperation or of an interdisciplinary approach between philosophy, law, political science, and social science. Some lack proximity to the institutional praxis, while others lack the theoretical development. Some disciplines have such a normative horizon that forget the social conditions needed for taking theories into practice, while others suffer from a limited interest in the theories of democracy or in the history of concepts. And that lack of interest is paid back with a perplexity hidden by the excess of empirical studies with little significance. Moravcsik is right when he states that there is an excessive presence of normative theories in European studies. But in my opinion, there is a more radical problem, a dichotomy between factual and normative, which has turned this field into a battle between realists without many hopes and idealists with little knowledge. What we probably need the most is a theory of Europe that is neither a simple description of the institutional mechanism nor a vague cosmopolitan haze. And it is precisely there where philosophy still has a lot to say. The polarization between theory and practice, between normative approaches and our empirical point of view, between disciplines dealing with values and those more comfortably moving among functional realities, has given rise to many different controversies inside human and social science. This dissociation is both a problem and a symptom, and we will not make Europe's reality comprehensible if we do without a certain assessment horizon. But we can neither do so if we keep a level of exhortative speech which seems to care very little about the real game of interests, the weight of our historical past, or the multiple determining factors that limit the political action of a space of deep interdependencies. Given the current status of European integration, we should not only await a mere description of facts or an abstract normative model when it comes to political philosophy, but we should expect a critical impulse and research on the possibilities of shaping the future ahead of us. Understanding the EU is not a merely descriptive exercise, but a reflection with normative consequences. That determines which are the reasonable expectations we may consider in relation to its form of government, its legitimacy and its democraticness. It is not the same to consider it as an intergovernmental negotiation or as a transnational experiment. We will not suggest the same solutions if we understand it as an aggregation of interests or as a deliberative discussion required by the political transformations of contemporary societies, their possibilities and specific risks. This is the context where the problem of formulating a new narrative for the European Union is considered with special intensity. Once certain big narratives, which made it comprehensible and conferred social legitimacy, are over. If Tocqueville's statement about human beings inventing things more easily than words to describe them is true, it could be confirmed that after the action and the description, we still have an added difficulty, that of making it understandable. We refer to this third task when we talk about a narrative for Europe. The different integration legitimacies being weakened, the only powerful narratives still standing are populist rebuttals fed by that evil game of blaming Brussels, and above all by the evidence that we are not up to the problems that we have to manage. In times where the lack of epic is not compensated by a functional legitimacy, in which the European project cannot rely on the resource to emphatic achievements or on the discrete favor of effectiveness, the landscape is filled with negative references. Everyone can understand what it is being suggested when talking about the monster of Brussels, as Hans Magnus Enzensberger used to say, with respect to which the appeal of more Europe emerges in the best case scenario as a weak speech. Among other things, this happens because we are in a moment of evolution of democratic societies in which, though there is no legitimacy that is worth without effectiveness, economic, regarding conflict resolution or of social order, the citizenship has the right to link the value of the European project to certain normative and political hopes. But in the worst case scenario, the rhetoric of progress in integration may implicitly suggest a deterministic historical linearity. The narrative of the Monnet method, dynamics in small steps with sustainable significance, takes many things for granted and at the same time has a coercive resonance, inviting us to surrender to what will end up being imposed. Any narrative that suggests that what we should do has nothing to do with freedom, with a contingent configuration, but with acceptance and submission of an inevitable dynamic, has little or no future in a democratic society. And the best way to make a narrative not be accepted is for it to imply that we are before a reality that cannot be rejected. In this sense, the integration theories have excessively emphasized inevitability. Explaining our crisis as simple regressions or stagnations on the integration process is mistaken and, above all, democratically unacceptable to the extent that it implies that our freedom is not convened in any way. Therefore, any European narrative must stop thinking about integration as a linear process and the crisis as an agent of change of that development. To pay more attention to the regressions and even to the concept of European disintegration. What I mean with this is that there will not be an Europeanist narrative, while we keep it in a deterministic corset which discredits, in principle, the other possibilities. We have made it really easy when we established an antagonism to organize the controversies between the pro-European and the Eurosceptic. While discussions revolve around whether certain political decisions should be communitarized or continue in the field of the states, such distinction constitutes a sufficient framework for analysis. But with the increasing complexity and multidimensionality of European politics, such distinction clashes with its own limits, because many of our problems cannot be reduced to the more or less Europe issue. This is so, among other things, because our controversies do not exclusively regard to the level of competence, but around the content of policies. Today, we discuss which political measures can or must be adopted to achieve the objectives set in the already integrated political fields, in such a way that those arguments cannot be categorized in pro-European and Euro-sceptical neutral perspectives. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello, my name is Jonathan White. I don't have a text to present to you. I'll be talking more tomorrow, but let me first say a few words, just echoing what Daniel has said. And first of all, let me express the satisfaction of being here and of representing the LSE's European Institute. When Daniel suggested to me a few months ago that we might do a conference here in this lovely city, in a place that can offer sunshine in November, and decent food as well, and with everything organised locally, I could hardly say no, and I'm extremely pleased that I did indeed go forward with this idea. I hope we're going to have some excellent discussions. It's my first time in Bilbao, so I think it would be premature for me to welcome you to Bilbao. But let me simply say how pleased I am that the European Institute at LSE is involved in this. Daniel has already set on the agenda, I think, some very important points for us to discuss, and let me just alight on a few of those, because I think they're quite important. Deficits, intelligibility deficits, conceptual deficits. I think I agree entirely with the denomination given to those deficits. Of course, if there's one thing there is no deficit of in the EU, it's deficits. And of course, in some ways, this is perhaps part of the problem of the EU. I mean, the deficit is the language of accounting. It's the language of the thing which lacks what otherwise would be complete. And I think maybe part of the conceptual deficit that Daniel is alluding to includes the idea of going beyond this way of thinking in terms of deficits itself to other ways of expressing the limitations of the EU as we find it. This emphasis on the dichotomy between the factual and the normative, I think, is extremely important. I think it's extremely important for anyone who is familiar with the scholarship on the EU, which increasingly is a highly specialized and policy-specific, institution-specific way of responding to what is ultimately a very broad macro-level process. One sometimes gets the impression of studies that are somehow disconnected from the normative questions that might give them their original point of orientation. I think, of course, that is a problem of political science more generally at the moment, and not just of EU studies, but perhaps one sees it in its clearest light in this field. And I think there may be a more general need to reconnect the study of institutions and of concepts in generally. This is a time, of course, when we are often thinking about more Europe or less Europe, another dichotomy which Daniel has drawn attention to. And I would entirely agree with the concerns about thinking in terms of Euroscepticism. Some of you will have had the chance to read Jürgen Habermas's recent publication on the lure of technocracy. And of course, one of the interesting moves in the argument is to diagnose dissatisfaction at a popular level with the European Union in terms of a lingering attachment to the democratic achievements of the nation state. One of the implications, I think, of this interpretation, whatever its empirical merits or limitations, one of the implications, I think, is to define what sometimes goes under the heading of Euroscepticism as an orientation which has some type of normative worth to it. In other words, expresses a honourable form of attachment rather than a form of attachment that might be denounced as something like nationalism, as xenophobia, as the types of orientation which opposition to the EU are very often expressed as. Of course, one may wonder, and I think certainly in Britain one may wonder at the moment, whether one can, in empirical terms, adequately understand a circumspect attitude towards the EU amongst populations in general in terms of this attachment to democratic institutions at the national level. Of course, it may be that concerns about the political institutions of the EU are simply the leading edge of concerns about political institutions at national as well as at European level. But I think to some degree that may be beside the point. This comes back exactly to what Daniel was suggesting about the need to find a point of interface between normative and empirical reasoning. I think it's very important the stakes with which we diagnose empirical tendencies have normative stakes already included within them, and that there is something, I think, very appropriate about trying to pull apart concepts like Euroscepticism for exactly that reason. In terms of where we're going from here, another theme of the Habermasian text is, of course, the cunning of reason. And I guess there is a possibility in which all the crises that have been enumerated already this morning, to do with the economy, to do with migration, to do with terrorism, can be seen in terms of the preconditions for going beyond such crises. One would have to congratulate reason on being especially cunning in the present age if this is indeed what's going on, since some of these tendencies seem to be reason for a great loss of optimism. But I think this is, again, a familiar theme worth holding on to, that the preconditions of further changes that may have a positive valuation can often be found in exactly these types of crisis tendency. I don't want to stay any more at this point because I think we've got plenty to be talking about in the next few hours, and I will have more to say myself tomorrow. But let me simply again thank Daniel and his team here for organising this event, and I look forward to the discussions we shall be having.
Thank you, Jonathan. So as the politician have spoken so briefly, we are not under the pressure of the time, and we can make a break, 10 minutes more or less. I don't know if a coffee break or a normal break without coffee. Without coffee, okay. The coffee comes later.